The morning mist clung to Thornfield Manor like a shroud, wrapping the ancient stone in layers of grey that softened nothing of its austere magnificence. Autumn had come early to this corner of Yorkshire in 1842, stripping the gardens of their summer splendour and leaving behind skeletal roses that clawed at the October air with thorns bared to the cold. The great house rose from the fog like something conjured from a melancholy dream, all Gothic towers and mullioned windows that reflected nothing but the dying season. And it was to this fortress of stone and silence that Lady Arabella Sinclair came as a bride. The carriage wheels crunched over gravel that seemed to announce her arrival with all the ceremony of a funeral procession, and through the small window she caught glimpses of the estate that was now to be her home, vast, imposing, beautiful in the way that winter itself is beautiful, which is to say beautiful without warmth. Her gloved hands twisted in her lap, worrying at the fine kid leather until she forced herself to stillness, to the composure that had been bred into her bones alongside her breeding. She was a Sinclair, after all, daughter of an old family, whose name still commanded respect, even as their coffers had emptied like sand through desperate fingers, and she would not shame that name by arriving at her new home with fear written plainly across her features. Yet fear lived in her chest nonetheless, a cold companion to the fragile hope she harbored like a candle flame cupped against the wind. This marriage had been arranged with the efficiency of a business transaction, which indeed it was, her family's crushing debts erased in exchange for her hand, her person, her future. The Marquis of Ashford had required a wife of proper lineage, and her father had required a miracle, and so the thing had been accomplished with contracts and signatures, and her mother's tears soaking into Arabella's wedding gown, as it was fitted. She had not met her intended husband until the day they stood before God and society to bind their lives together, and even then she had seen only the sharp line of his profile, the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his jaw remained, clenched throughout the ceremony, as though he were enduring some physical torment. But she was young, and hope is the province of youth, and as the carriage drew to a halt before the great entrance of Thornfield Manor, Arabella Sinclair allowed herself to believe that perhaps, in time, this arrangement might transform into something resembling happiness. The footman opened the door, and the cold air rushed in to greet her, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and damp earth, and something else, something indefinable, that felt like loneliness made manifest. She accepted his hand and stepped down onto the gravel, her dove-grey travelling dress whispering around her ankles, and lifted her eyes to the manor that would be her cage or her castle, depending entirely upon the mercy of the man who now owned her future. The great doors stood closed against her, dark oak banded with iron, and as she moved toward them with careful, measured steps, she felt the weight of watching eyes from the windows above, felt herself assessed and found wanting before she had even crossed the threshold, and understood, with a clarity that pierced her heart, that whatever hope she carried would need to be a resilient thing indeed to survive in this place of stone and shadow. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. The great hall of Thornfield Manor stretched before her like a cathedral built to worship cold propriety, all soaring ceilings and dark paneling that swallowed the weak afternoon light, filtering through windows set too high to offer any glimpse of comfort or sky. Arabella stood just inside the entrance, her travelling cloak still damp from the mist, and it was there that she saw him for the second time in her life. Julian Ashford, Marquis of Ashford, master of this domain, and now master of her fate, standing at the far end of the hall with his back to her, as though her arrival merited no more attention than the delivery of the morning post. He was tall, she noted again as she had noted at their wedding, with the kind of aristocratic bearing that seemed bred into the very bones, shoulders broad beneath the perfect cut of his coat, dark hair touched with auburn where the light caught it, and when he finally turned at the sound of the butler's throat-clearing announcement of her presence, she found herself confronted once more with a face of such severe beauty that it might have been carved from the same unforgiving stone as the manor itself. His features were classical, almost cruel in their perfection, high cheekbones, a mouth set in a line that suggested it had forgotten how to curve into anything resembling warmth, and eyes of such a pale grey that they seemed to look through her rather than at her, assessing and dismissing in the same glance. The wedding ceremony rushed back to her in a flood of sensory memory, the way his hand had been cold as marble when he placed the ring upon her trembling finger, the sound of his voice speaking the vows with all the enthusiasm of a man reciting his own death sentence, the absolute absence of any softness in his expression as he had lifted her veil and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that held no promise, no tenderness, only obligation discharged. She had trembled through the entire ceremony, her hands shaking so badly that her bouquet of white roses had scattered petals across the church floor like snow or tears, and he had not once met her eyes with anything resembling kindness or even simple human acknowledgement. Now, standing in his hall, she waited for him to speak, to welcome her, to offer even the barest courtesy that one might extend to a stranger seeking shelter. But instead, he turned to the butler and said, in a voice of such cultivated disinterest that it cut more deeply than any insult, "Mrs. Hartwell will show Lady Ashford to her chambers. See that she has everything required." Not to her, not one word directed to her, though she stood not 20 paces distant, though she was his wife, though every rule of decency demanded at least the pretense of civility. He spoke of her as though she were not present, as though she were a piece of furniture to be stored in an appropriate room, and then he simply walked away, his footsteps echoing against the stone floor with a finality that sounded like doors closing, like keys turning in locks, like the ceiling of a tomb. Arabella stood frozen, confusion and hurt warring in her chest, understanding crystallizing like ice around her heart. This was not to be a marriage of slow warming, of gradual acquaintance growing into affection. This was to be something else entirely, something she had no name for, something that felt like punishment for a crime she had not committed. That first night, alone in chambers that were beautiful and cold and separated from his by what might as well have been an ocean, she lay awake in the darkness and asked the silent room what she had done to deserve this exile, this marriage that was no marriage at all. But the answer that came back was only the sound of wind against ancient windows and the settling of old stones, and she understood that whatever her offense had been, she had committed it simply by existing, by being the woman he had been forced to marry, by being there at all. Mrs. Hartwell appeared the following morning, like an answer to a prayer Arabella had not known how to voice, a woman of perhaps 50 years with kind eyes, set in a face that had known both sorrow and endurance, and there was something in the way she looked at the new Marchioness that spoke of sympathy without pity, understanding without judgment. "My lady," she said, her voice carrying the soft burr of Yorkshire, "I am Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper. His lordship has instructed that I am to assist you in learning the management of Thornfield." The words were proper, formal, yet beneath them Arabella heard what was truly being offered, an ally in this fortress of isolation, perhaps the only friend she might find within these walls. They walked through the manor together that first day, Mrs. Hartwell explaining the household routines with efficient grace, and Arabella listened and observed, and began to understand the magnitude of the domain she was expected to oversee, this vast machinery of servants and schedules and traditions that had operated for generations without pause. Yet even as she tried to focus on matters of menus and linens and the proper ordering of a Marchioness's day, she could not help but notice the whispered conversations that ceased when she approached, the pitying glances exchanged between maids, the way the footmen looked at her with a sort of uncomfortable sympathy that made her skin prickle with humiliation. They knew. Of course they knew. In a household of this size, nothing could be hidden, and the fact that their master refused to speak to his new bride, that he avoided her presence as one might avoid contagion, and had surely spread through the servants' quarters like wildfire. She held her head high and pretended not to notice, pretended that her heart was not breaking with each pitying look, and she threw herself into learning the intricacies of household management with a determination born of desperation, for if she could not have her husband's regard, she could at least have purpose, competence, dignity. The days began to establish their cruel pattern. She would wake alone, breakfast alone in her chambers, because the thought of sitting at that vast dining table with only her own thoughts for company was unbearable, and then she would attend to household matters, and all the while she remained painfully aware of where he was, as though she carried some internal compass that pointed always toward his location. Twice she encountered him in corridors, and twice he turned and walked away before she could speak, his face a mask of such deliberate indifference that it felt like a physical blow. Once she entered the morning room to find him reading correspondence, and he simply stood, gathered his papers, and departed without a glance, leaving her standing in the doorway, feeling like a spectre haunting her own life. She began to explore the manor in earnest, partly to learn her new domain, and partly to escape the suffocating loneliness of her chambers, and what she discovered was a house of faded grandeur, a beauty that had been neglected, not from lack of funds but from lack of love, as though the very walls had absorbed the coldness of their master and reflected it back in peeling paint and tarnished fixtures and rooms that had been closed off because no one cared enough to open them. In the portrait gallery on the second floor, she found Julian's ancestors staring down at her with expressions of stern judgment. Generations of Ashfords, with the same aristocratic features, the same pale grey eyes, the same mouths that looked incapable of smiling, and she wondered if coldness was bred into the very bloodline, if warmth was something these people had systematically eliminated from their natures as one might weed a garden. Yet the house itself whispered of better times, of an era when music had filled the ballroom and laughter had echoed in the halls. And standing alone among the stern-faced portraits, Arabella felt her loneliness intensify into something almost physical, a weight pressing against her chest, and she understood with terrible clarity that one could be utterly alone, even in a house filled with people, perhaps especially in a house filled with people who witnessed one's abandonment and could do nothing to prevent it. Weeks passed with the relentless quality of water wearing away stone, each day identical to the last in its cold routine, and Arabella found that her initial hurt and confusion were slowly transmuting into something else entirely, something more akin to determined curiosity, for she had begun to understand that her husband's silence, however painful, was itself a kind of language, and if she could not engage him in conversation, she could at least learn to read the text of his existence within these walls. She became a student of his habits, observing from careful distances the patterns of his days. He rose early, always before dawn, and rode out across the estate before breakfast, returning with his dark hair wind-scattered and something in his face that looked almost peaceful before the shutters came down again. He took breakfast alone in his study, conducted business with his steward in the mornings, and then most afternoons he disappeared into the east wing of the manor, into the library that she had glimpsed only once, a room of floor-to-ceiling shelves and leather-bound volumes, and the kind of hushed reverence that churches aspired to but rarely achieved. She began to find excuses to pass by the library in the early evenings, and once, when he had left the door slightly ajar, she caught a glimpse of him seated in a chair by the window, with a book open in his hands, and an expression on his face that was utterly transformed from the cold mask he showed the world, something soft and absorbed and almost vulnerable, and she realized with a start that this was where he lived his true life. In these pages, in these stories, in worlds that demanded nothing of him but his attention. When he left the library, she would sometimes slip inside and examine the books he had been reading, running her fingers over volumes of poetry and philosophy, Greek tragedies and modern novels, and she began to construct an image of his inner landscape from these literary breadcrumbs. He favored stories of honor and betrayal, of duty conflicting with desire, of noble souls trapped in impossible circumstances, and she wondered what pain had driven him so deeply into these fictional sorrows that he could not bear to remain present in his own life. Yet the greatest puzzle was the contradiction she observed between his treatment of her and his treatment of nearly everyone else on the estate, for she learned through Mrs. Hartwell's careful comments and through her own observations during walks around the grounds that Julian was known among the tenants as a fair and even generous landlord, that he had reduced rents during poor harvests, that he had personally paid for the doctor when old Thomas Weatherby's wife had taken ill, that he had given the blacksmith's son funds to apprentice in London. She watched from her window one afternoon as he stopped to speak with a tenant farmer, saw him dismount and crouch down to speak to the man's small daughter, saw something in his face that was almost a smile when the child presented him with a handful of wildflowers, and the tenderness of that moment, brief as it was, made her want to weep with frustration and confusion. He had kindness in him, clearly, compassion and generosity, and even gentleness. So why did he reserve only cruelty for her, only this unbearable silence, only this studied indifference that felt more deliberate than any active hatred could be? Her determination shifted then, crystallizing into something new. She would no longer seek his approval or his acknowledgement, for that path led only to madness and despair. But she would understand him, would decode the mystery of this man who was capable of such contradictions, and perhaps, in understanding, would come either acceptance or the strength to endure what could not be changed, and perhaps, though she barely dared admit this even to herself, perhaps in understanding him, she might find the key to reaching him, to breaching whatever walls he had built around his heart, though what she would do with such a key, if she ever found it, remained a question she could not yet answer. Understanding, Arabella began to realize, was not the same as surrender, and if she could not breach the walls her husband had built around himself through direct assault, perhaps she might instead offer small tokens that would signal her willingness to meet him in the territory of his choosing, in that realm of literature and beauty where he seemed most himself, most at peace, most human. She began leaving books in the library, volumes she selected with great care from the shelves after studying his preferences, a first edition of Wordsworth's poems when she noticed his tendency toward the romantics, a new translation of Dante that she ordered specially from London, a slim volume of Shakespeare's sonnets that she placed on the reading table by the window where he always sat, each gift anonymous, unsigned, a quiet offering that asked for nothing in return. She took to tending the winter roses in the garden along the path he rode each morning, coaxing the hardy blooms through the early cold, pruning and mulching with her own gloved hands despite Mrs. Hartwell's protests that such work was beneath a marchioness, and there was something deeply satisfying in the simple physicality of the labor, in nurturing these stubborn flowers that refused to yield to winter's harshness, and she wondered if perhaps she was cultivating her own stubbornness as much as theirs, her own refusal to wither under the frost of his indifference. One morning she heard his voice as she worked behind the garden wall, speaking to Thomas the groundskeeper with more animation than she had ever heard from him, and her hands stilled on the rosebush as she listened. "The winter roses are particularly fine this year, Thomas. Your work in the gardens has been exemplary." The groundskeeper's response carried equal parts pride and honesty. "Cannot take credit for the roses, my lord. That would be her ladyship's doing. She's out here most mornings, tending them herself." A long silence followed, so extended that Arabella held her breath, and when Julian finally spoke again, his voice had changed, become quieter, though whether with displeasure or something else she could not determine. "I see. That is most dedicated of her." Hope flared in her chest like a candle suddenly shielded from wind, bright and warm and almost painful in its intensity, and for the rest of that day she moved through her duties with a lightness that felt foreign after weeks of heaviness, permitting herself to imagine that perhaps her small gestures were not invisible after all, that perhaps somewhere beneath his armor of silence he was aware of her efforts, perhaps even touched by them. But the following morning he passed the rose garden without pausing, without so much as a glance in her direction, and in the library that evening she found the books she had left precisely where she had placed them, their spines uncracked, their pages clearly unread, and the hope that had burned so bright guttered and died, leaving behind only the familiar ache of rejection. That night she sat at her writing desk and composed a letter to her sister Margaret, the only person in the world to whom she could speak the truth of her circumstances. "Dearest Meg, I find myself in the peculiar position of being married yet more alone than I have ever been in my life. He will not speak to me. He will not look at me. I am a ghost in my own house, and some days I wonder if I shall simply fade away entirely from the sheer weight of being unseen." She paused, her pen hovering over the paper as she confronted the question that had been growing in her mind like a shadow. Could she endure this marriage, this half-life of silence and separation, for years, perhaps decades, until death released her from vows that had bound her to a man who would not acknowledge her existence? The question terrified her, not because she feared the answer might be no, but because she suspected, with a grim certainty, that the answer was yes, that she would endure because she had no choice, because her family's survival depended on this marriage, because she had been raised to understand duty and sacrifice, and because somewhere in the depths of her heart, despite everything, she still harbored a foolish, stubborn hope that things might somehow change. She finished the letter, sealed it, and then sat in the darkness of her chamber, with her hands folded in her lap, and made herself a promise. She would not break, would not beg, would not debase herself by pleading for scraps of attention from a man who had made his feelings, or lack thereof, abundantly clear. and if she must live this life of elegant imprisonment, she would do so with dignity and tact, with her spine straight and her head high, and she would find purpose and meaning in the work of the estate and in service to those who depended upon Thornfield, even if she could never find love within its cold walls. 3 months had passed since Arabella had arrived at Thornfield Manor, 3 months of silence and separation that had settled into a rhythm as predictable as it was painful, when winter arrived in earnest with a violence that seemed to mirror something wild and desperate in her own heart, and on a day when the sky hung low and heavy with the promise of snow, she walked out into the gardens without proper cloak or bonnet, driven by a restlessness she could not name, a need to feel something other than the numbness that had become her constant companion. The rain began as she reached the rose garden, not the gentle misting rain of autumn, but a cold, driving deluge that soaked through her thin day dress within moments, and still she stood there among her winter roses, tilting her face to the sky, as if the water might wash away the accumulated sorrow of these months. And by the time she returned to the manor, she was shivering so violently that Mrs. Hartwell cried out in alarm and immediately summoned the doctor, for even Arabella could recognize that the cold had penetrated deep into her bones, settling there with an ominous heaviness. The fever came that night, raging through her with a ferocity that left her insensible, lost in dreams that twisted the reality of her waking life into even more nightmarish shapes, and through the haze of her illness, she was dimly aware of Mrs. Hartwell's worried face, of the doctor's grave pronouncements, of the servants moving quietly through her chamber with cool cloths and medicinal draughts. What she did not know, could not know in her fevered state, was that Julian had been informed of her illness within an hour of the doctor's arrival, and that his reaction, witnessed only by his valet Henderson, had been a sight remarkable enough that Henderson would speak of it in whispered tones to Mrs. Hartwell. The Marquis had gone white as death itself, and had gripped the back of his chair with such force that his knuckles stood out stark against his skin, and had demanded to know every detail of her condition with an urgency that bordered on violence. Mrs. Hartwell, who had served the Ashford family for 30 years and had learned to read the subtle signs of emotion beneath aristocratic restraint, noticed that his lordship took to pacing the corridor outside Arabella's chamber in the evenings, noticed that he questioned her extensively about the Marchioness's condition each morning, and noticed the barely concealed anxiety in his eyes when she reported that the fever had not yet broken. On the 3rd night of Arabella's illness, when the crisis was at its peak, and the doctor had admitted with grim honesty that the outcome remained uncertain, Mrs. Hartwell emerged from the sick room near midnight to find Julian standing in the darkened corridor like a sentinel, still dressed in his evening clothes, his face haggard in the candlelight, and though he said nothing, his presence spoke volumes that his silence had previously denied. It was then, with Arabella's life hanging in the balance behind that closed door, that Julian spoke his first words about his wife to anyone other than in the most impersonal terms, and though his voice was quiet, almost strangled, the words carried a weight that made Mrs. Hartwell's eyes sting with sudden tears. "See that she has everything she needs, Mrs. Hartwell, everything. Spare no expense. Bring specialists from London if necessary. Whatever she requires to recover, it shall be provided." And then, after a pause in which something seemed to break behind his carefully maintained facade, "She must recover. Do you understand? She must." Mrs. Hartwell understood, perhaps better than Julian himself understood in that moment, and she returned to her patient with renewed determination, and whether through the doctor's skill, or the strength of Arabella's own constitution, or perhaps through the sheer force of Julian's desperate, unspoken will, the fever broke at dawn on the 4th day, and Arabella woke weak but clear-headed to find Mrs. Hartwell weeping with relief beside her bed, and outside in the corridor, unbeknownst to her, Julian finally allowed himself to return to his own chambers, his vigil ended, his secret kept, the crack in his armor carefully concealed once more beneath the stone mask he showed the world. Recovery came slowly to Arabella, measured in careful steps from bed to chair, from chair to window, from window to the hallway beyond. And in those quiet days of convalescence, she found herself possessed by a curious clarity, as though the fever had burned away something more than illness, had purged from her the desperate need for Julian's acknowledgement that had colored her first months at Thornfield Manor, and what emerged from the ashes of that fever was a woman who understood, perhaps for the first time, that she could not spend her life waiting for a man to grant her permission to exist, to matter, to find purpose within these walls that had become her prison and her home. When she was strong enough to resume her duties, she did so with a subtle but profound shift in her bearing, no longer arranging her days around the possibility of encountering Julian, no longer timing her visits to the library or the gardens in hopes of crossing his path, and instead she turned her full attention to the estate itself, to the tenants and servants and land that constituted the true heart of Thornfield, and in doing so discovered that she possessed talents and inclinations she had never before had opportunity to develop. Mrs. Hartwell noticed the change immediately, remarked upon it to Henderson one afternoon in the servants' hall. "Her ladyship has come into her own, I think. There's a strength in her now that wasn't there before." And indeed, Arabella moved through the manor with new purpose, consulting with the steward about improvements needed to tenant cottages, ordering repairs to roofs that had been neglected, ensuring that the elderly widow Parsons received additional coal for her hearth, and that the blacksmith's youngest son, who showed promise with letters, received primers and instruction. She established a small school in one of the unused estate buildings, teaching the tenant children herself on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and there was something deeply satisfying in watching young minds grasp new concepts, in being genuinely needed and appreciated, in building something good from the wreckage of her romantic hopes. What Arabella did not know, could not see, was that Julian observed these transformations from a distance, standing at his study window as she walked with the steward across the south fields, lingering in the corridor when she met with Mrs. Hartwell to discuss household matters, and in his chest there grew a feeling that he could not name, would not name, a mixture of admiration and something deeper, something that terrified him precisely because it echoed feelings he had sworn never to permit himself again. He watched her one cold March afternoon from the library window as she sat in the refurbished schoolroom, surrounded by tenant children, her face animated as she guided small fingers across slate boards, and unbidden there came to his mind the image of another woman. Years ago, Clarissa, with her calculated smiles and mercenary heart, who had played at loving him for his title and fortune while sharing her true affections with a penniless officer, and the memory of that betrayal rose up like bile, bitter and corrosive, a reminder of why he had built these walls, why he had chosen silence and distance as his armor against future pain. Yet even as the old wound ached, he could not deny the evidence before his eyes. Arabella was nothing like Clarissa, possessed none of that calculated artifice, and her kindness to those who could offer her nothing in return, her dedication to work that brought her no advantage, spoke to a character fundamentally at odds with the mercenary creature who had shattered his ability to trust. And this recognition filled him with a conflict so profound that he turned from the window, pressed his palm against the cold glass, and whispered words he had not permitted himself in months. "What have I done?" "Have word." The Dowager Marchioness arrived at Thornfield Manor on a bright April morning without prior notice, sweeping through the entrance hall with the imperious confidence of one who had been mistress here for 30 years before relinquishing the role, and Arabella, summoned hastily from her morning correspondence, felt her stomach tighten with apprehension as she descended the stairs to greet the formidable woman who had attended her wedding with an expression of barely concealed disapproval. Lady Catherine Ashford possessed the same aristocratic features as her son, softened only slightly by age, and her sharp grey eyes assessed Arabella with a thoroughness that made the younger woman feel as though every inadequacy were being catalogued and noted. Yet Arabella met that scrutiny with the composure she had learned during these difficult months, curtsying with perfect propriety and murmuring the appropriate words of welcome. The Dowager's visit, ostensibly a courtesy call to see how the new Marchioness was settling in, revealed its true purpose over tea, when Lady Catherine announced with the casual authority of one accustomed to absolute obedience that she would be hosting a dinner party at week's end to properly introduce Arabella to local society, and that both she and Julian would naturally attend as guests of honor. Arabella's teacup trembled slightly in her hand, for she understood immediately what this meant. The first time she and Julian would be required to appear together publicly as husband and wife, to perform the pantomime of marital unity before the watching eyes of society, and the prospect filled her with a dread so profound she could barely form words to acknowledge the announcement. The week that followed passed in a blur of preparation, Mrs. Hartwell consulting endlessly about appropriate attire, while Arabella tried on gown after gown, seeking something that would armor her adequately for the ordeal ahead, finally settling on a dress of deep sapphire silk that brought out the blue of her eyes and lent her pale complexion a becoming luminosity. On the evening of the dinner party, as her lady's maid arranged her hair in an elaborate style that left her neck bare and vulnerable, Arabella studied her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman who looked back, for despite the elegant gown and carefully arranged curls, her eyes held a wariness that no amount of powder and paint could disguise, the expression of one preparing for battle rather than a social gathering. The Dowager's London townhouse blazed with light as their separate carriages arrived, and Arabella felt Julian's presence before she saw him, that familiar tension that always accompanied their proximity, and when he emerged from his carriage and their eyes met across the torchlit courtyard, she witnessed something remarkable. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time in 4 months, and in his dark eyes she saw surprise, admiration, and something that might have been regret flicker across his features before his customary mask descended once more. Inside, the dinner was an exercise in excruciating formality, with Arabella seated at Julian's side, so close that his sleeve occasionally brushed her bare arm and sent unwelcome shivers through her body, and she navigated the evening with desperate grace, smiling at appropriate moments, conversing intelligently with the gentleman to her left, all while hyper-aware of Julian's brooding silence beside her. It was Lady Imogen Hertford, a beautiful blonde whom Arabella vaguely remembered from her wedding, who delivered the cut that made the evening's true nature clear, remarking in a voice pitched to carry, "How charming that the Marquis has finally decided to acknowledge his little bride in public, though one wonders what has changed after months of such pointed neglect." And though Arabella maintained her composure, kept her expression serene, she saw Julian's jaw tighten, saw his hand clench around his wine-glass with such force that she feared the crystal might shatter, and for one breathless moment she thought he might actually speak, might defend her against the barely veiled mockery, but instead he remained silent as stone, and Arabella felt something inside her chest crack just a little further, even as she smiled and raised her own glass, as if she had not heard the cruelty beneath Lady Imogen's honeyed words. The carriage ride back to Thornfield Manor passed in suffocating silence, with Arabella and Julian occupying opposite corners of the compartment, as though the space between them were filled with something toxic and untouchable, and she kept her gaze fixed firmly on the darkened window, watching the night-shrouded countryside blur past, while her mind replayed Lady Imogen's cruel remarks, and the worse cruelty of Julian's continued silence in the face of them, and by the time they arrived at the manor, she felt hollowed out, emptied of everything except a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with the late hour. She descended from the carriage without waiting for assistance, gathered her skirts, and moved toward the entrance with mechanical precision, wanting only to reach the sanctuary of her chambers, where she might finally remove the mask of composure she had worn throughout that interminable evening. But as she crossed the threshold into the great hall, she became aware of footsteps behind her, Julian's distinctive stride, and she paused despite herself, her heart beginning a treacherous acceleration even as she warned it against hope. He stopped perhaps 3 paces behind her, close enough that she could hear his breathing, and the silence stretched between them heavy with words unspoken, weighted with 4 months of accumulated longing and pain and unacknowledged connection, and Arabella waited, her back still turned, her hands clasped so tightly before her that her knuckles whitened, and she thought perhaps this would be the moment, that Lady Imogen's public cruelty had finally penetrated the armor he wore so ruthlessly that he might speak, might offer some word of explanation or comfort or simple acknowledgement of what she had endured tonight on his behalf. She heard him draw breath as if to speak, heard the slight shift of his weight, and slowly, giving him time, she turned to face him, and what she saw in his face made her own breath catch, and struggle written in every line of his features, his dark eyes burning with something that looked almost like anguish, his jaw working as though words fought to escape against terrible restraint, and she waited, silent and still, offering him the space to cross the chasm that yawned between them, every fiber of her being focused on that moment of potential transformation. But even as she watched, even as hope began its fatal bloom in her chest, she saw the shutters descend once more, saw his expression close and harden, saw him step backward as though she were something dangerous from which he must retreat, and without a word, without a single syllable after that eloquent struggle, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the hall until they faded into the depths of the house and left her standing alone in the flickering candlelight. Arabella stood frozen for a long moment, trembling with the effort of maintaining her composure, and then, with the careful deliberation of one who has suffered a mortal wound but refuses to acknowledge it, she proceeded up the stairs to her chambers, dismissed her waiting maid with a gentle firmness that brooked no argument, and only when the door was closed and locked behind her did she allow the tears to come, sinking onto the edge of her bed as 4 months of accumulated grief and loneliness and rejection poured out in silent, wrenching sobs that shook her entire frame. What she could not know, could not see, was that Julian stood in the corridor outside her door, one hand raised and frozen halfway to knocking, his own face contorted with anguish as he listened to the sound of her weeping, each sob like a blade between his ribs, and the war within him raged with renewed violence, his fear of betrayal, his certainty that opening his heart again would lead only to destruction, battling against the undeniable truth that in protecting himself from potential pain, he was inflicting real and terrible suffering on a woman who had done nothing to deserve it, and after an eternity he lowered his hand, pressed his palm flat against the door, as though he might somehow reach through the wood to comfort her, then turned and walked away, leaving her to cry alone while he retreated to his study and the decanter of brandy that offered the only solace he would permit himself. The weeks that followed the disastrous dinner party brought with them the transformation of spring, and as May arrived at Thornfield Manor, the estate seemed to awaken from its long winter slumber, the gardens exploding with colour, the air warming and filling with the scent of apple blossoms and fresh-turned earth, and something in Arabella transformed as well, for the pain of that night when Julian had once again chosen silence over connection, had burned away the last of her desperate hope and left in its place something harder and perhaps more valuable, a determination to find contentment within the confines of her circumstances rather than perpetually yearning for what would never be given. She threw herself into estate management with renewed purpose, working alongside the steward to plan crop rotations and repair tenant cottages, establishing a small school in the village where children might learn their letters, organizing a lending library from Thornfield's extensive collection so that those who wished to improve themselves might have the means to do so, and in this work she found a satisfaction that had nothing to do with her husband's approval or acknowledgement, a sense of purpose that belonged to her alone. The servants, who had initially pitied the young Marchioness for her husband's coldness, now spoke of her with genuine affection and respect, marveling at how she remembered each of their names and inquired after their families, how she rolled up her sleeves to help in the still-room during preserving season, how she sat up all night with the head groom's wife when the woman laboured to bring her first child into the world, and Mrs. Hartwell remarked to the butler that they had not had such a true lady of the manor since the old Marquis's grandmother, a woman legendary for her kindness and capability. What Arabella did not know, could not see, was that Julian observed all of this from an ever-decreasing distance, his surveillance of her activities becoming almost obsessive in its intensity, and where once he had avoided any room she occupied, now he found reasons to be near, standing in shadowed doorways to watch her arrange flowers in the hall, positioning himself at study windows that overlooked the gardens where she worked, riding out to inspect the very tenant farms she had just visited so that he might hear the families speak of her generosity and genuine care for their welfare, and with each observation, the architecture of protection he had built around his heart developed new cracks, new points of vulnerability. She had stopped looking for him, he realized with something approaching panic, stopped turning her head when he entered a room, stopped positioning herself where they might accidentally encounter one another, and this absence of seeking unnerved him profoundly, for he had grown accustomed to her hopeful glances, her careful attempts at proximity, and now that she had withdrawn that attention, he discovered that he missed it with an intensity that bordered on physical pain. Her independence both attracted and frightened him. This woman who had arrived at Thornfield 5 months ago with apprehension in her eyes and desperation in her circumstances, who had endured his calculated cruelty with dignity, and who had now somehow transcended her need for him even while remaining trapped within their marriage, and Julian found himself in the peculiar position of having achieved exactly what he thought he wanted. A wife who expected nothing from him and who had ceased to hope for his affection, only to discover that this victory tasted of ashes and brought him no peace whatsoever, for the control he had sought through silence was slipping through his fingers like water, and he was left grasping at nothing, while she moved through Thornfield like a beacon of light that illuminated everything except the darkness in which he had chosen to dwell. It was an afternoon in late May when Arabella entered the East Wing Library, seeking a specific volume on estate management that Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned. The room flooded with golden light that streamed through the tall windows and illuminated the thousands of leather-bound spines that lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and as she searched the upper shelves near Julian's customary reading chair, she noticed a slim volume that had been misshelved, wedged behind a row of larger books, as though someone had hidden it there deliberately or perhaps thrust it away in a moment of pain. And when she pulled it free, several letters fell from between its pages, fluttering to the floor like wounded birds, their paper yellowed with age, and their ink faded but still legible in the slanting afternoon light. She should not have read them, she knew this, even as she knelt to gather them, knew that these were private correspondence not meant for her eyes, but something in the elaborate feminine handwriting caught her attention. The way certain words seemed to leap from the page with calculated cruelty, and before she could stop herself she was reading, her hands beginning to tremble as the contents revealed themselves with devastating clarity. Letters from a woman named Clarissa, written in a tone of such manipulative sweetness laced with contempt that Arabella felt her stomach turn, references to dear Julian's devotion and how easy it is to secure his affection when one knows his weaknesses, mentions of another man, someone referred to only as my true love, and a final letter dated 3 years prior that spoke with breathtaking callousness about how she had extracted what value I could from the engagement before the scandal had broken and the arrangement had been dissolved. Arabella read each letter twice, her mind racing to connect these revelations with the man who had punished her with silence for 5 months, and suddenly his behavior took on an entirely different character, transformed from incomprehensible cruelty into the desperate self-protection of someone who had been publicly humiliated and betrayed, who had offered his heart and had it crushed with calculated precision, who had been used as a means to an end by someone he had trusted completely, and her own heart, which had hardened somewhat over the past months out of sheer necessity, softened entirely as she imagined Julian younger and more open, perhaps even tender, discovering that the woman he had planned to marry had loved another all along, had used him for his title and position while mocking him in private correspondence. She sat for a long time on the library floor, with those poisonous letters spread around her, understanding flooding through her like light through a prism, illuminating all the small moments of the past 5 months. His struggle outside her door after the dinner party, his vigil during her illness, the way his jaw had tightened when Lady Imogen had made her cruel remarks, and she realized that every instance of his silence had been not an attack upon her but a defense against her, a wall built to prevent the repetition of devastation, and while this did not excuse the pain he had caused her, it explained it, rendered it comprehensible, transformed him from monster into wounded creature. She gathered the letters with careful hands, placed them back exactly as she had found them, returned the volume to its hiding place behind the larger books, and left the library with a heart that felt simultaneously heavier and lighter, burdened with new knowledge but freed from the terrible not knowing that had haunted her, and she resolved in that moment that she would not confront him with this discovery, would not force him to acknowledge what he had clearly tried to bury, but would instead continue as she had been patient, present, waiting for the day when he might find the courage to lower his defenses and risk vulnerability again. For she understood now that his silence was not about her unworthiness, but about his fear, and that fear could only be overcome by time and consistent proof that she was not Clarissa, that her heart held no deception, that her commitment to their marriage was real and unshakable, regardless of the circumstances that had forged it. Julian Ashford stood at the window of his private study in the hours before dawn, unable to sleep, as had become his wretched custom, watching the estate grounds emerge slowly from darkness, as grey light crept across the lawns and gardens that Arabella had transformed with her careful attention, and he pressed his forehead against the cool glass, as though the chill might somehow quiet the tumult that raged perpetually within him. This daily torture of wanting desperately to speak to his wife while remaining paralyzed by a fear so profound it had become the governing force of his existence. 5 months now he had maintained his silence, 5 months of observing her from shadows and doorways, cataloguing every kindness she showed to servants and tenants, every moment of grace under the weight of his cruelty. And with each observation, the architecture of his defenses grew more unstable, threatening to collapse entirely and leave him exposed to the very vulnerability he had sworn never to experience again. The memories rose unbidden as they always did in these dark hours. Clarissa's face when she had laughed at his discovery of her betrayal, the malicious amusement in her eyes as she explained with perfect composure that she had never loved him, had only accepted his proposal because her true love, a penniless younger son, could not offer her the title and position she craved, and that she had planned to marry Julian for his name while maintaining her affair with discretion. But since the scandal had broken, she would simply pursue more amenable arrangements elsewhere, and was he not fortunate, she was releasing him from such an obviously doomed match. He had been 26 then, young enough to believe that love conquered all obstacles, naive enough to trust completely, and the public humiliation that followed the whispers at social gatherings, the pitying looks, the barely concealed amusement that the proud Marquis of Ashford had been made such a spectacular fool had scorched something essential from his soul, left him convinced that vulnerability was synonymous with destruction and that trust was merely the prelude to betrayal. His father, dying 2 years later, had extracted a promise from him with his final breaths, that Julian would remarry, produce an heir, fulfill his duty to the family name, regardless of his personal devastation. And Julian had agreed because one did not refuse a dying father's request, but he had determined that this time he would maintain absolute control, would select a bride from such desperate circumstances that she would never dare deceive him, would keep her at such distance that she could never truly wound him, and Arabella had seemed perfect for this cold calculus, beautiful enough to satisfy appearance, desperate enough to be controlled, gentle enough to manage easily. Except nothing had proceeded according to his plan, for Arabella had proven impossible to categorize or predict, her dignity in the face of his cruelty, more affecting than tears would have been, her gradual withdrawal into independence more devastating than her initial attempts at connection, and now Julian found himself in the peculiar agony of having achieved exactly the isolation he had sought, only to discover that it brought no safety, only a different species of pain, sharper and more constant than anything Clarissa had inflicted. He wanted to speak to Arabella, God, how he wanted to speak to her, to explain himself, to apologize, to ask if perhaps they might begin again, but each time he gathered his courage, the memories rose like a wall between them. Clarissa's laughter, the public shame, the sickening certainty that he was fundamentally unlovable, that anyone who claimed affection for him was simply better at concealing their true motives, and his throat would close, and the words would die unspoken, and he would retreat once more into the prison of his own construction, while across the house Arabella moved through her days with increasing self-sufficiency, requiring less from him with each passing week, and Julian watched his plan to keep her at distance succeed so completely that he was losing her without ever having had her at all. His control revealed as the illusion it had always been, leaving him grasping at shadows, while the substance of what they might have been together slipped irrevocably beyond his reach. The rose garden had become Arabella's particular sanctuary in these late spring weeks, a place where she could lose herself in the practical work of tending the climbing varieties that covered the southern wall of the manor, their blooms heavy with fragrance that reminded her of her childhood home, and on this particular morning she had decided to prune the highest canes that had grown wild over the winter, reaching above her head with shears while balanced precariously on the old wooden ladder that the groundskeeper had warned her was unstable, but which she had assured him would serve well enough for this small task. She was deeply absorbed in her work, the physical labor providing relief from the constant awareness of Julian's presence somewhere in the house, that peculiar tension that had become the permanent condition of her existence, and she did not hear his approach along the gravel path, did not know he had paused at the garden entrance, as was his custom these past weeks. Observing her with that intensity, she sometimes felt like heat against her skin, but never permitted herself to acknowledge directly. The ladder shifted beneath her weight, as she stretched to reach a particularly stubborn cane, the old wood creaking in warning, and she felt the precise moment when the leg gave way, felt gravity claim her in that suspended instant, before falling when the mind comprehends disaster. But the body has not yet experienced it, and she gasped as the world tilted sickeningly, and she began to drop backward toward the stone path below. Julian moved with a speed that seemed impossible given the distance between them, covering the garden length in what could only have been seconds, though to Arabella it felt like an eternity of falling. And suddenly there were hands on her waist, strong and sure, breaking her descent and pulling her against a solid chest, and the impact of landing in his arms, rather than on unforgiving stone, drove the breath from her lungs in a rush of shock and relief. The world stopped in that moment, suspended as completely as she was suspended in his embrace, and Arabella found herself staring up into Julian's face from a distance of mere inches, close enough to see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, close enough to feel his breath against her cheek, close enough to observe the way his pupils dilated as they stared at each other with an intensity that made her heart hammer against her ribs. With such force, she was certain he must feel it through the layers of fabric that separated them. His hands remained on her waist where they had caught her, his fingers pressing into her sides with a firmness that bordered on desperation, and she watched his throat work as though he were trying to swallow words, watched his lips part as though speech might finally emerge after 5 months of silence, and she held her breath, hoping and fearing in equal measure, being suspended, not just in his arms, but in the possibility of this moment becoming the transformation she had waited for with such patient anguish. "My lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible, and she felt him flinch at the sound as though she had struck him, saw something crack in his expression, some careful control, giving way to raw emotion, and for 3 heartbeats she was certain he would speak, certain the wall between them would finally crumble, but then his face shuttered once more, and he set her on her feet with a gentleness that contradicted the abruptness of his withdrawal, and without a word he turned and walked away, though not before she saw his hands trembling at his sides, shaking with what might have been fear or desire or both. And long after he had disappeared into the house, Arabella stood in the garden touching her waist where his hands had been, feeling the ghost of his touch like a brand against her skin, and despite everything, despite 5 months of silence and loneliness and confusion, she felt hope kindle in her chest once more, fragile and tentative but undeniably real, because a man who trembled after touching his wife was not a man who felt nothing, and perhaps silence was not the opposite of love, but merely its terrified guardian. The Dowager Marchioness arrived at Thornfield Manor 3 days after the incident in the garden, her carriage pulling up to the entrance with the decisive authority that characterized all her actions, and she swept into the house with the kind of purpose that made servants step quickly aside, and Julian, upon being informed of her presence, feel an uncharacteristic flutter of something approaching apprehension, for his mother possessed the singular ability to see through every defense he had ever constructed, and had never hesitated to dismantle them with surgical precision when she deemed it necessary for his own good. He received her in the drawing-room with the formal courtesy their relationship demanded, bowing over her hand and inquiring after her health and journey. All the small rituals of their class, that provided a veneer of civilization over what he suspected would prove to be a deeply uncomfortable conversation, and his mother endured these pleasantries for precisely the amount of time propriety required before dismissing them with a wave of her gloved hand and fixing him with a look that had made him confess childhood transgressions decades ago, and had lost none of its efficacy in the intervening years. "Sit down, Julian," she commanded, not requested, and he found himself obeying despite being the master of this house and no longer a boy to be ordered about, settling into the chair across from hers, while she regarded him with a mixture of exasperation and concern that made something in his chest tighten painfully. "I have been patient," she began, her voice carrying that particular tone that indicated her patience had reached its absolute limit. "I have waited for you to come to your senses, to recognize what is plainly obvious to everyone in this county, except apparently yourself, but I can wait no longer because that girl upstairs, your wife, in case you have forgotten, is being destroyed by your cruelty, and I will not stand by and watch you repeat the mistakes that nearly ruined you once before." Julian felt anger flare hot and immediate, the automatic defense against anyone who dared broach the subject of Clarissa, but his mother continued before he could marshal his objections, leaning forward in her chair with an intensity that pinned him in place. "Do not," she said sharply, "do not dare to claim this is about protecting yourself, because we both know that what you are doing to Arabella has nothing to do with protection and everything to do with cowardice, with your refusal to acknowledge that not every woman is Clarissa Pemberton, that not every offer of affection is a disguised betrayal, and that by treating your innocent wife as though she were guilty of another woman's crimes, you are becoming the villain in your own story, rather than the victim you insist on remaining." The words struck like physical blows, each one landing with devastating accuracy on wounds Julian had convinced himself were long healed, and he rose from his chair in agitation, pacing to the window because he could not bear to meet his mother's eyes while she dismantled the careful justifications he had built around his behavior these past 5 months. "You know nothing of what I endured," he said, his voice low and rough with suppressed emotion. "The humiliation, the public mockery, the certainty that I was fool enough to believe in love only to discover it was elaborate manipulation, and I cannot endure that again." His mother rose as well, crossing to stand beside him at the window, and when she spoke her voice had softened, though it lost none of its directness. "I know everything of what you endured, my son. I was there through all of it. I held you through the worst of it. And I know that Clarissa Pemberton was a mercenary creature who saw you as a stepping stone to position rather than as a man worthy of love. But Julian, that girl loves you, yes, loves you. You fool, I have seen it in her eyes every time your name is mentioned, in the way she has tried so desperately to make a home in this mausoleum you've created, in her dignity, in the face of treatment that would have broken a lesser woman. And you are destroying her and yourself with this silence, this distance, this stubborn refusal to see that Arabella is not Clarissa and never could be." Julian turned to face his mother fully, and she must have seen something in his expression, some crack in the armor, some admission of the agony he had been living with, because her face softened further, and she reached up to cup his cheek as she had when he was a child. "Release her or claim her properly," she said gently but firmly, "but do not continue this halfway existence where you are married but not married, where you observe her from shadows while denying yourself and her any chance at the happiness you both deserve. Because, my darling boy, you are not being fool again by trusting Arabella. You are being fool right now by refusing to trust her, by letting Clarissa win even though she has been gone from your life for years, by choosing fear over the possibility of love." And with those words hanging in the air between them, the Dowager Marchioness left the room, left her son standing at the window, with his carefully constructed defenses crumbling around him, and the terrible, wonderful possibility taking root that perhaps his mother was right, that perhaps he had been destroying the very thing he most wanted by trying so desperately to protect himself from wounds that Arabella had never intended to inflict. And for the first time in 5 months, Julian allowed himself to consider that his silence might not be protection at all, but merely another form of betrayal, this time of a woman who deserved so much better than the ghost of a husband he had given her. The letter arrived on a morning that marked precisely 6 months since Arabella had crossed the threshold of Thornfield Manor as its new Marchioness. 6 months since she had last heard her husband speak directly to her. 6 months of silence and observation, and the peculiar half-life of being married yet utterly alone. And when Mrs. Hartwell brought the black-bordered envelope to the morning room, where Arabella was reviewing household accounts, something in the housekeeper's expression prepared her for devastation, even before she broke the seal with trembling fingers and read the words that confirmed her father had passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 days prior, and that her presence was requested at home, though it was no longer truly home, was it? For she had been sold away to save the very estate where her father now lay awaiting burial for the funeral arrangements and the settling of his affairs. She sat very still after reading, the letter resting in her lap while the words blurred before her eyes, and she felt a curious numbness spread through her limbs, as though her body were protecting her from the full weight of grief by rendering her incapable of feeling anything at all, though beneath that numbness she was aware of a deeper pain waiting to crash over her like a wave, and the knowledge that her father had died without seeing her again after that terrible day when he had wept and begged her forgiveness for arranging her marriage to a man who had proven himself capable of such sustained cruelty, and she had assured him it would be well, that she would make it well, a promise she had failed to keep through no fault of her own, but which now sat like ashes in her mouth. Mrs. Hartwell summoned her maid without being asked, and within the hour, Arabella was directing the packing of her travelling trunk with the efficient detachment that had become her armour against all the disappointments of her married life, and she sent word through a footman to inform the Marquis that she would be departing for her family estate within 2 hours and expected to be gone for a fortnight, maintaining, even now, the fiction that they communicated through intermediaries rather than acknowledging the brutal reality that her husband refused to speak to her at all, and she felt a distant contempt for herself that even in grief she could not bring herself to simply walk to wherever he was in this vast house and tell him directly, could not break the pattern they had established, because to do so would be to admit how thoroughly abnormal their arrangement was, how completely she had failed to forge any true connection with the man whose name she bore. The coach was being prepared in the circular drive when Julian emerged from his study and inquired of a passing servant why there was such activity, and when told that the Marchioness was departing for a family funeral, something happened to his face that made the young footman take an involuntary step backward, some combination of shock and horror and what might have been anguish, and without a word, Julian strode through the house with a speed that sent servants scattering, taking the stairs 2 at a time to reach the entrance hall, just as Arabella was descending with her travelling cloak already fastened, and her bonnet ribbons tied beneath her chin, and for the first time in 6 months they stood in the same space and looked directly at each other. Truly looked, and Julian felt the full force of what his mother had tried to make him understand, come crashing down upon him, because Arabella's face was pale with grief, her eyes red-rimmed from crying she had done in private, and the thought of her leaving, of the house empty of her presence, of losing even the distant awareness of her moving through rooms he avoided, filled him with a panic so acute it was nearly physical pain, and he knew with sudden terrible clarity that somewhere in these 6 months of observing her from shadows, of watching her transform his cold house into something resembling a home, of witnessing her kindness and dignity and quiet strength, he had begun to need her in ways he had sworn he would never need anyone again, and the possibility of her gone felt like losing something essential he had not known he possessed until faced with its absence. Julian moved without conscious thought, his body propelling him forward before his mind could construct the familiar defenses that had kept him silent for half a year, and he was through the entrance and down the steps before the footman could even open the coach door, his hand raised in a gesture that halted the driver mid-motion and brought a confused stillness to the assembled servants, who had never seen their master emerge from the house with such obvious agitation, such complete abandonment of the rigid control that had characterized every moment of his existence, since Clarissa Pemberton had taught him that vulnerability was merely another word for foolishness, and when Arabella appeared in the coach doorway, surprise flickering across features already drawn with grief, Julian found himself suddenly, terribly bereft of words. All the speeches his mother's confrontation had inspired, dying unuttered in his throat, because how could he possibly explain 6 months of cruelty in the space of moments? How could he make her understand that his silence had never been about her unworthiness, but about his own cowardice? And so he simply stood there looking up at her while she looked down at him, and the tableau held for a heartbeat. 2, 3. The entirety of their strange, sad marriage, compressed into this single suspended moment where everything and nothing might change depending on what happened next. Arabella descended from the coach with careful dignity, her travelling dress black in mourning, her face pale as marble, and just as composed, and she waited with the patience that had become her defining characteristic through these long months, waited for him to speak or step aside or do whatever it was he intended by stopping her departure, and Julian saw in her eyes that she expected nothing, that 6 months had taught her not to hope for words from him, and that resignation struck him with more force than anger ever could have, because she had stopped believing he was capable of giving her anything beyond silent observation and cold distance, and the knowledge that he had done this to her had reduced a woman of warmth and courage to this careful emptiness, made him despise himself with an intensity that was almost cleansing in its completeness. He opened his mouth and nothing emerged, his voice unused for direct address to her, rusty with disuse in all the ways that mattered failing him at the moment he most needed it, and he saw something flicker in Arabella's expression, some last fragile hope beginning to die, and then a single tear escaped to slide down her cheek, just one, tracking a silver path through the powder she had applied to hide the ravages of her grief, and she spoke into his silence with a dignity that destroyed him. "My lord," she said, and her voice was steady despite that tear, steady and exhausted and unbearably sad. "I have endured your silence for 6 months. I have lived as a ghost in your house, and accepted that this is to be the sum of our marriage. But my father is dead, and I must go to him. So I ask you now, may I have leave to bury my father, or will you deny me even this?" The words fell between them like stones into still water, and Julian felt something crack apart in his chest, some final barrier he had constructed against feeling too much, against risking too much, and suddenly the fear that had governed his every action since Clarissa seemed small and contemptible compared to the reality of Arabella's tear, her dignified sorrow, her assumption that he would deny her even the basic compassion of mourning, and he understood with devastating clarity that in protecting himself from the possibility of betrayal, he had become the betrayer and had inflicted on an innocent woman the very cruelty he had sworn never to endure again, and the realization broke him completely, shattered every defense until he stood before her as raw and exposed as he had been in those first days after Clarissa's deception, and from that brokenness he found at last his voice. "Forgive me," Julian said, and the words came out raw and broken, his voice roughened by months of restraint and the weight of emotion he had imprisoned behind silence. And Arabella stared at him as though he were a spectre made suddenly corporeal, her eyes wide with shock, because these were the first words he had spoken directly to her in 6 months, the first acknowledgement that she existed as more than a piece of furniture to be avoided. And Julian saw her astonishment and felt it like a blade between his ribs, evidence of how completely he had severed any expectation of normal discourse between them, and he reached out with a hand that trembled visibly and said again, "Forgive me, please. Come back inside. Let me—" But his voice broke on whatever he had meant to say next, and Arabella allowed him to take her arm and guide her back up the steps, while the assembled servants tried very hard to appear as though they were not witnessing the most extraordinary scene in the manor's recent history, their master actually touching their mistress, actually speaking to her. And Julian led her not to any of the formal receiving rooms, but to the small drawing room that adjoined the library, the room where he sometimes sat in the evenings with a book and a glass of brandy, his private sanctuary into which he had never invited anyone, and he settled her carefully onto the settee, as though she might shatter from rough handling, and then he stood before her and seemed to struggle with where to begin. How to explain 6 months of cruelty to a woman whose only crime had been accepting a marriage proposal that would save her family from ruin. "I had a prior engagement," he began, his voice still rough but gaining strength through use, and he saw Arabella's expression shift from shock to careful attention. "Before my father died, before you, there was a woman named Clarissa Pemberton, and I believed—" He paused, swallowed hard against the bitterness that still rose whenever he thought of those days. "I believed she loved me for myself, that our marriage would be built on genuine affection rather than the mercenary arrangements so common to our class. But I was a fool, blinded by my own arrogance and her considerable talents for deception, because while I was planning our future, she was conducting an affair with a cavalry officer, and she married me for the title with every intention of continuing her liaison, once the ring was safely on her finger." He watched Arabella's face as he spoke. He saw understanding begin to dawn there, along with something that might have been pity, and he could not bear her pity, though he knew he deserved nothing better. And he continued, "The scandal was considerable when the affair became public, and I obtained an annulment through channels that need not concern you, and I vowed I would never again allow anyone close enough to make a fool of me, that if I must marry, and my father's deathbed demand that I produce an heir made marriage unavoidable, then it would be to someone who understood from the beginning that ours would be an arrangement of convenience only, and I would provide for her materially but never emotionally, and when your father's circumstances made you available, I thought—" He stopped, shame flooding through him at the memory of his calculated coldness. "I thought silence would protect me from caring, from being vulnerable, from risking again the humiliation Clarissa had dealt me, but Arabella, I was wrong, so terribly wrong, because you are not Clarissa, You have never been anything but good and patient and kind, and I have repaid that kindness with a cruelty that shames me." Julian saw the understanding in Arabella's eyes, and felt both relief and deeper shame, because she had already discovered the letters and already pieced together the story of his humiliation, and chosen to respond with patience rather than confrontation, and this knowledge that she had known, and still extended grace, made his cruelty these past months seem even more monstrous. And he continued speaking because now that the dam had broken, he could not seem to stop the flood of words, all the observations and acknowledgments he had denied himself through 6 months of self-imposed silence. "I watched you," he said, and his voice dropped lower, became almost confessional in its intimacy. "Every day I watched you, catalogued every kindness you showed to the servants, to the tenants, to the very gardens themselves. I saw you leave books in the library, and I read every single one because they were your recommendations, and I wanted to know your mind. I stood in the shadows when you taught the tenant children to read, and marveled at your patience. I heard you speak gently to Mrs. Hartwell about her rheumatism, and watched you implement changes to make the staff's lives easier, and every act of goodness was like a stone added to the crushing weight of my own cowardice, because I could see that you were everything. Clarissa was not genuine where she was false, kind where she was cruel, patient where she was demanding, and yet I could not let go of my fear, could not risk believing that you might be what you appeared to be, because Clarissa had appeared genuine too until she wasn't, and I thought if I just maintained distance, maintained silence, I could protect myself from ever being vulnerable again." He moved to the window, unable to meet her eyes as he made his next admission, his reflection in the glass, showing him a man who looked haggard and older than his years, worn down by the effort of sustaining cruelty against his own inclinations. "But I was not a victim in this, Arabella. I was a coward, because you gave me no reason to distrust you, no cause to treat you as I did, and I knew it even as I continued my silence, knew that I was punishing you for another woman's sins, using you as a shield against feeling anything that might make me vulnerable, and the truth is that my silence was never about protecting myself from you. It was about protecting myself, from the knowledge that I wanted to speak to you, wanted to know you, wanted to be the husband you deserved, instead of the ghost I had become." He turned back to face her, and the afternoon light through the window cast his features in sharp relief, showing every line of anguish and regret that marked his face. "You deserved a husband, and I gave you a ghost, gave you silence and coldness and a house to manage, but no partnership, no companionship, none of the things that make a marriage bearable, let alone happy, and I have no right to ask anything of you after 6 months of such treatment, but I am asking anyway because I am selfish enough to want a chance at redemption, even if I have not earned it." He crossed to where she sat and knelt before her, this proud Marquis who had held himself so rigidly apart, and he took her hands in his with a gentleness that contradicted 6 months of studied coldness. "Let me accompany you to your father's funeral," he said, and his voice carried both plea and promise. "Let me stand beside you as a husband should. Let me support you through this grief, as I failed to support you through every day that preceded it, and when we return, let me begin again. Let me court you as I should have from the beginning. Let me earn what I tried to take without giving anything in return. Because, Arabella, I want to be the man you deserve, and I am finally ready to try." The journey to Arabella's family home began in silence, but it was a different silence than the one that had characterized their marriage these 6 months, for this silence held possibility rather than rejection, anticipation rather than despair. And as the carriage rolled through the countryside, with Julian sitting across from her rather than refusing to share the space at all, Arabella found herself stealing glances at her husband, as though seeing him for the first time, this man who had finally spoken, finally explained, finally asked for a chance to begin again. Julian caught her looking once, and instead of turning away as he would have done even yesterday, he held her gaze and said quietly, "Tell me about your father." And so she did, the words coming haltingly at first because she had grown so accustomed to silence, but gradually gaining fluency. As Julian listened with an attention so complete, it felt like a physical presence, and she spoke of her father's kindness, his struggles after her mother's death, the series of poor investments that had brought their family to the brink of ruin, and the guilt he had carried at having to marry her to the silent Marquis to save them all from debtor's prison. "He wrote to me," she said, her voice catching. "Every week," he wrote, asking if I was happy, and I could never bring myself to tell him the truth, because it would have broken his heart to know that his salvation had purchased my loneliness. And Julian's expression showed such pain at this revelation that Arabella reached across the space between them without thinking and touched his hand. A gesture that made him go absolutely still before his fingers slowly curled around hers, their first voluntary touch, their first moment of connection freely chosen. They spoke for hours as the landscape changed outside the carriage windows, Julian sharing his own history in greater detail now that the dam of silence had broken, telling her of his childhood in the vast manor, with parents who showed more affection to their hunting dogs than to their son, of the loneliness that had driven him to books and solitary pursuits, and of how Clarissa had seemed like a miracle because she had appeared to want him rather than his title. And Arabella understood then that they were both wounded creatures, both carrying scars that made trust difficult, and perhaps that understanding could be the foundation of something real. The funeral was small and somber, held in the village church where Arabella had been christened, and Julian stood beside her throughout with a steadiness that she had never expected from him, his hand at her elbow, and his presence a bulwark against the weight of grief. And when her younger sister Margaret threw herself into Arabella's arms, weeping, Julian quietly ensured that the girl had a handkerchief and a moment of privacy with her sister, demonstrating a thoughtfulness that made Arabella's heart turn over in her chest. Afterward, when they returned to her family's modest home, so different from Thornfield Manor's grandeur, Julian met her surviving family members with a courtesy that held no condescension, and when he learned the extent of their continued financial struggles despite the marriage settlement, he immediately made arrangements for additional support, not as charity but as family obligation, speaking to Arabella's uncle with a respect that made the older man's eyes shine with grateful tears. The journey back to Thornfield began 2 days later, and this time when they settled into the carriage, Julian sat beside her rather than across from her, their shoulders touching through the layers of traveling clothes, and somewhere in the middle of the second day's travel, Arabella found herself leaning against him in exhaustion, and Julian's arm came around her shoulders, tentative at first, then more firmly when she did not pull away, and she fell asleep to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and woke to find him watching her with an expression of such tender wonder that she felt heat rise to her cheeks. They spoke of lighter things on this return journey, books they had both read, opinions on estate management, small observations about the passing scenery, building gradually toward the intimacy that should have begun 6 months ago. And when Arabella laughed at something Julian said about a particularly pompous neighbor, his face transformed completely, the rigid coldness melting into a smile that made him look years younger and impossibly handsome, and she realized with a start that she had never seen him smile before, not once in 6 months of marriage. As the carriage finally rolled up the drive to Thornfield Manor in the late afternoon light, the familiar building looked different to Arabella, less imposing, and more like a home that might someday be filled with warmth rather than silence. And when Julian handed her down from the carriage, he did not immediately release her hand, but instead held it while he looked up at the manor's facade and then back to her face. And he said with visible nervousness, "May I call upon you tomorrow? Properly, I mean, as a gentleman calls upon a lady he hopes to court, because I realize we have done everything backward and I should like to try to do at least something in the correct order." And Arabella, feeling hope bloom in her chest like the roses she had tended through the long winter, smiled and said softly, "Yes, my lord, you may call upon me tomorrow." And the expression of relief and joy that crossed Julian's face was worth every moment of loneliness she had endured to reach this beginning. 3 years had passed since that day when Julian had finally broken his silence, and Thornfield Manor had transformed so completely that it seemed impossible it had ever been the cold mausoleum of Arabella's first arrival, for now in the fullness of late spring the gardens blazed with color, the windows stood open to admit sunshine and birdsong, and the halls rang with warmth and laughter, instead of echoing with loneliness and unspoken grief. Arabella sat in the rose garden she had once tended as an act of desperate hope, but now she tended it as an act of joy, and beside her on a blanket spread across the grass, their son, 2-year-old Thomas, named for her father, played with wooden blocks while Julian lounged nearby, his hand occasionally reaching out to steady the child or to brush against Arabella's arm in one of the countless small touches that characterized their days now. These constant physical reassurances that they were real, that they were together, that the silence had been conquered by connection. Julian caught her watching him and smiled, that transformation of his features that still made her heart catch even after 3 years of seeing it daily. And he said softly, "What are you thinking, my love?" And she replied truthfully, "I was remembering the first day I arrived here, how frightened I was, how certain I was that I had married a man who would never see me as anything more than an obligation." And Julian's expression grew serious as he reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that had become habitual between them. "I see you," he said, as he had said countless times since that day of confession. "I see you, Arabella, and I thank God every morning that you had the patience to wait for me to find my courage." And she leaned into him, remembering the long months of silence, but remembering more clearly the moment when everything had changed, when her single tear had broken through his defenses and he had finally spoken, finally explained, finally begun the work of becoming the husband she deserved. She thought of their first kiss, which had come 2 weeks after his formal call upon her, when he had courted her in her own home, with flowers and conversation and trembling earnestness, and she had finally taken mercy on his nervousness and kissed him herself, surprising them both with her boldness, but more with the passion that had ignited between them once the walls had finally come down. And she remembered, too, their wedding night remade not the cold, silent horror of the first one, but the tender, passionate claiming that had come months later when Julian had asked her permission to truly be her husband, and she had granted it with her whole heart. Their son laughed suddenly, a bright sound that drew both their attention, and Julian scooped the child up with practiced ease, holding him high and making him giggle with delight. And Arabella watched her husband with their son, and felt such fullness in her chest that it seemed impossible she had ever been the lonely girl who had walked these halls in silence and despair. The life they had built together was not perfect. They still had moments of misunderstanding, still carried scars from their difficult beginning, but it was real and hard-won and precious beyond measure. And Arabella knew that the patience she had shown, the determination not to break even when breaking would have been easier, had purchased something far more valuable than mere survival. It had purchased transformation, redemption, and a love that was all the stronger for having been forged in the crucible of suffering and silence. Dear listener, perhaps you have found yourself in a place of silence, in a relationship or circumstance where you give and receive nothing in return, where patience seems like foolishness and hope feels like a luxury you can no longer afford. And if so, know this. Arabella's story teaches us that some transformations cannot be rushed, that some walls must be dismantled brick by careful brick rather than demolished in a single moment, that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not the dramatic gesture, but the quiet persistence of showing up day after day with grace and dignity intact. Not every silence will end as Arabella's did. Some silences must be walked away from. Some walls were never meant to be scaled, but there is profound strength in maintaining your own integrity while others find their way, in refusing to let another person's wounds make you cruel in return, in choosing patience without becoming a martyr to it. The key is in knowing the difference between patience that comes from hope and patience that comes from fear, between waiting for transformation and waiting for permission to exist. And Arabella knew that difference, because even in her patience she maintained her sense of self, her purpose, her determination to be fully human, even when her husband was giving her only silence in return. May you find the wisdom to know when to wait and when to walk, when to persist and when to protect yourself. And may you understand that the patience that leads to transformation is always grounded in self-respect rather than self-abandonment. And if you have been the one hiding behind silence and walls, may you find the courage Julian found to speak your truth before it is too late, to risk vulnerability before the cost of protection becomes higher than the cost of openness, to understand that the person waiting for you on the other side of your fear might be exactly the person worth being brave for. This story comes to you from love, laughter, and happily ever after, where we believe in the power of patience, the possibility of transformation, and the enduring truth that sometimes the greatest love stories are not about love at first sight, but about love that grows slowly in the darkness until it is finally strong enough to withstand the light. If this story has touched your heart, subscribe to join our community of believers in second chances, and may you rest well tonight, knowing that no silence lasts forever, that every wall can be dismantled, and that patience paired with hope is never wasted, for it plants seeds that may take seasons to grow, but will bloom all the more beautifully for the waiting.